Welcome to the History of Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today, author Prit Buttar and his book Meat Grinder about Germany and Russia just absolutely going to town on each other in World War II. It's a fantastic book. I really enjoyed talking to Prit. He's a doctor. He's an author. The guy does everything. And also, by the way, patient as all hell. I was having horrible internet problems as we were talking, and he just rolled with it. It was a fantastic conversation. Let's get to it right now, and then hopefully I can get him to come back when the internet isn't making my life miserable. And here we are with author Prit Buttar, Meat Grinder, the battle for the Rzhev Salient. Prit, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me.
Very first question, right off the bat. You are an actual medical doctor, retired. When did you decide that being a doctor was too easy, you needed to start writing historical books?
Actually, the writing of historical books came out of my medical life. I had an elderly patient with a very pronounced German accent. And when I was looking after her, she was beginning to develop dementia and from time to time would start wandering off into German during consultations. And my German was just about okay. I could keep up with her. And one day I just asked her which part of Germany she had come from. And she ended up telling me the story of how she grew up in East Prussia, fled her homeland literally under artillery fire from the Red Army, met her future husband in North Germany, and then moved to the United Kingdom. And whilst researching her story, I found myself gathering information which led to my first book. And I've never really looked back from there. One book led to the next, and so on.
Well, what I was thinking about is I wanted to know, are you more of an author or more of a doctor? And I figured out a way we can test it. Authors generally have to write a lot, so they have pretty good penmanship, whereas doctors generally have atrocious penmanship. Where do you fall on that scale?
Yeah, I kind of knew this was coming at some point, yeah. I think I will fall back on the traditional defense of doctors, which is that pretty much everybody gets to see a doctor's handwriting. Very few people get to see their bank manager's handwriting or their lawyer's handwriting or whatever. So I'm going to claim that they're just as bad as doctors, and I defy anyone to prove me wrong on that. But who knows?
All right, I will take that answer, even though it was a bit roundabout, but I hear you. Now, before we get into the book, which I absolutely loved, we do have to talk about one more medical thing. I was looking at your Twitter, and you, along with a lot of other people, love the show The Last of Us. I just want your overall thoughts. How are you enjoying it?
Well, I've just watched episode 8 tonight. Again, it just left me breathless at the end of it. There are so many shows that you watch where either some of the characterization is wrong, or the pace is a little bit off, or the plot starts to get a little bit maybe repetitive or just too, there's always an element of suspension of belief in any sort of show, but sometimes you're left thinking, oh, come on, really? Whereas on this one, absolutely not. They have really hit every single target you would want them to hit to make a show like this a success. There's one more episode to go for me before the end of the season. I don't know whether it's going to be a single season show or whether there will be more. And it's perfect because it leaves you wanting more, but also thinking, I hope it's a sort of satisfying thing where it isn't left on a cliffhanger and that you can wrap it up and just savor what you've had.
More importantly, as a doctor, when is the fungus actually going to take over and kill all of us? I have asked my nurse practitioner girlfriend. I didn't like her answer, so I want to hear your answer. What do you think?
Okay, that's intriguing. Now I need to know what she had to say, really. But I don't think it's going to be a fungus that's going to get us. I think there are far nastier viruses lurking. We have the experience of the last few years of just how nasty that can be. The really scary thing about COVID is that it was the third coronavirus outbreak in the 21st century, preceded by SARS and MERS, both of which, on a case-by-case basis, were actually more lethal. COVID killed a lot of people because it was very, very infectious. But if you had it, you had a pretty good chance of survival. Whereas if you had SARS or MERS, you were far more likely to die as an individual. Next time, and there will be a next time, we may not be so lucky. We may get something as deadly as SARS or MERS, but as infectious as COVID. And that is just truly apocalyptic. And we really, really need to be thinking very hard about that.
Now, my girlfriend's answer was basically what you said first, like, no, there's a lot of stuff that would take us out first. Then she used a lot of big words and something about how a fungus has a lot better places to go. We are not a great place to be, so it's going to go a lot of other places before it decides to use us as a host.
I think that's a fair point, yeah. All organisms are just seeking to multiply and reproduce. So if they can do it more easily in a different host, that's where they're going to go. So I guess we're just going to have to wait and see, aren't we?
Yeah, we're just going to knock on wood and hope it's much, much later and we don't get any more plagues and whatnot. At least for, I'm thinking 20 years would be nice.
I'll take that.
All right, let's talk about Meat Grinder. You know, you've already talked about, you've done other books. What made you decide that Meat Grinder was going to be this next one that you were going to do?
Well, this kind of touches on one of the other questions that you sent me. And I've been thinking an awful lot about something that I like to think about as emotional arithmetic. And it's something that human beings are actually not very good at. So most people will have personal experience of a bereavement at some point in their lives. And we all know what that feels like. Even when we hear about, let's say, a car crash and 5 people being killed, we struggle to multiply that grief by 5. We see it as a terrible thing. Perhaps it's worse than the one bereavement we suffered, but we don't think of it as being 5 times as bad. And then as the numbers start to grow and we get into something like an earthquake in Turkey recently with tens of thousands dead, we get into wars with millions of people dead, we get into the Holocaust with 6 million Jews and however many other people killed, we just go numb. We have no emotional way of engaging with this. And one of the things that struck me when I was researching Meat Grinder, as well as just general parts of the Eastern Front that hadn't been covered particularly, was the sheer scale of the bloodletting around this salient, but also actually a fairly rich source of personal accounts of the fighting, which I think is the only way that you can really anchor it in an emotional sense. It's the only way that you can read about these awful statistics of 150,000 dead and wounded in one particular campaign, and then think every one of those 150,000 was an individual, and they had stories like the ones that I found for my book. And it's the only way that you can really find an anchor for that. And if we did that more often, and if we succeeded more often in actually engaging emotionally with these numbers, maybe we wouldn't end up with so many hundreds of thousands killed.
One of the things when reading Meat Grinder, and you pointed out as well, but you start to read this, is this part of the world, this part of the war, everyone goes, oh, Stalingrad. And that's where all of the focus goes to. But, I mean, your book is looking to all the people just outside there that are basically forgotten in this war, right?
Well, this is the thing, isn't it? This is a huge, huge battlefront. You know, I remember seeing a little video graphic of casualties suffered by different nations, the armies of different nations in the Second World War. It's like a bar chart, and it sort of scrolls past you as you watch this thing. And you go past the British and the French and everybody else, and the American losses, etc. And then you get to the bars that represent Soviet casualties, and they are just terrifying. They are immense. This is a nation that suffered so much. You know, it wasn't just at the famous battles, Moscow, Stalingrad, Kursk. There was just huge bloodletting at completely forgotten episodes like the Rzhev Salient, particularly forgotten in this case because it was actually an inconvenient bit of history for the Soviet Union to have thrown so many men at this salient for so little gain. There is a limit to how much you can dress this up as this was part of some cunning plan to grind down the German army, or you have to see this as part of a a larger scale. So Stalingrad wouldn't have been possible if it weren't for the Red Army heroically tying down so many divisions in the central sector. It's nonsense. It's just untrue. But that was the only way they could rationalize what had happened. And the very fact that even by doing that, they still had to forget large chunks of what had happened in order to make it at all credible, just gives you an idea of just what a disaster it was for the Red Army. And as an ex-soldier myself, I find it so appalling and so sad that tens of thousands of men who fought and died there can just be forgotten in this manner, or their deaths can be dismissed as, oh, well, it was necessary just to stop the Germans moving a few divisions. And it just seems to me a massive injustice to these sons of the Soviet Union who, like soldiers in any army in the Second World War, were just doing what they believed to be their patriotic duty. And to have their lives discounted like that just strikes me as just so cruel and unjust. And we're seeing it again now with the casualties that are piling up in the eastern parts of Ukraine, where people are going to try to justify this in all manner of ways. But in the end, every single one of those deaths, that's a future unlived. It's a set of dreams not fulfilled. And like I say, if we could only empathize at that sort of level, maybe we wouldn't repeat these disasters time and again.
Your point of view on that comes through in your books, because I've read a lot of military history, and one of the things that I find you to be just exceptional at is picking those small little moments with the soldiers, particularly the one, and I was thinking about this, the Russian soldiers trying to blow up the bridge.
Yes.
And they're trying to do it, something goes wrong, and one of them basically nearly commits suicide, or at least tries to, just to get it done. Compare and contrast that to what we'll get to is there's definitely leadership that needs to be crucified for what was done. But how do you choose those anecdotes? Because that's really where you bring that home, that it's very easy to hate a Nazi. It's very easy to look back at the Red Army and talk about the atrocities that they do. But at the same time, there are a lot of these men who were doing what they were thinking were doing, and they're like, the guy on the other side is going to do this to me, so I'm going to do it to him. How do you choose those anecdotes to really bring the humanity home?
I'm really pleased that you picked up on that. I've always been attracted to that sort of personal dimension of these battles. It's so easy for it to become a sterile exercise of little divisions represented by squares on a map moving around, and even with little columns of numbers of tanks left. Each of those tanks has a crew of 5. How many of those guys died when the numbers went down? And, the sheer terror of fighting. From my own army days, even, on some of the field exercises, I remember that massive sense of utter confusion and when fright in the middle of the night, when you can't see, something unexpected has happened, you've lost contact with the guys around you, and you're trying to, get the platoon back together, and there's always somebody who's missing, and then it's a matter of, do we look for them? Do we press on? And those are the sorts of moments that I try to use just to anchor the narrative. So many of the accounts left by the generals are very, very self-serving, and that's true whether we're talking about British or American or German or Soviet generals. Dennis Showalter, who sadly is no longer with us, he wrote in one of his books a beautiful sentence where he said, any memoir or autobiography by a person in a prominent position, the title could be paraphrased as the story of a hero by one who knows him well. And, there is such an element of self-justification, of diluting your errors. You read the memoirs of somebody like Manstein or Hermann Balk, they never ever admit that they got something wrong.
I do remember from my own army days, I used to tell people, the army is one of those jobs where at least once a day you'll go, who did what? Are we sure about this? Did somebody there's just amazing things happening, whether you're out in the field or whether you're back.
Yes.
It just brings a certain amount of element that something is going to go wrong. And as an American, Mike Tyson says, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face.
Exactly that. You are dealing with an environment in which so much can go wrong. Even if all of your own equipment works perfectly and everyone around you does exactly what they're supposed to do, and they do in the right order and they do it at the right time. There is so much potential for things to get disrupted. And in a way, there is something quite reassuring about these stories of the universality of things just getting screwed up. And also just, as I said before, the sheer resourcefulness of people under pressure who manage to find some way of not necessarily making it that at least they get out of that position that they're in.
We talk about these deaths and everything, but I do have to bring up something very specific. That must have been hard for you to write because we're not on video, we're not recording video, but there is a gorgeous dog that's been coming in behind you. There is a section here about how Russians decided to use dogs, which, I mean, listen, it's very easy to hate Nazis, and then you hear about the Russians with the suicide dogs. That's got to be rough because, when you're writing something, you always want to kind of, even with books like this, you want to have a hero. But even for you, like you were pointing out, this was vicious from both sides. There was things done that everybody looks back and goes, that's messed up. And one of those things was that the Russians would use dogs to run under tanks with bombs and blow them up. When you're writing something like that, how do you kind of keep perspective instead of going like, oh, I can't deal with this stuff?
Well, there are occasions when that's exactly how I feel about it. Next month, I have a book coming out on the Lithuanian Holocaust. And when I was writing about that, there were times when, at the time, I had a rather elderly golden retriever. And there were times I would just say to him, come on, man, we need to go for a walk, just to get away from this horror. And we would go and sit on a hillside near the house and just listen to the birds song and just try to get a bit of distance from those things. There is so much of that, isn't there? These terrible things, some of the atrocities that are committed. But, oh my goodness, to treat dogs in such a manner, anybody who has spent any time with dogs will know that you can be pretty horrid to a dog. You can be quite cold to them or whatever. You show them a little bit of kindness from time to time, and those dogs will die for you. They will do anything to be in your good books. And then to take this creature that is so loyal and will do anything for you and to turn it into a killing machine, really, and moreover, it's going to die itself in the process. And, when the Soviets did this, the dog handlers were under orders that after they had armed the explosive charge on the dog had saddlebags, I guess, with the explosives in them. And the poor thing then had a trigger mechanism which consisted of a vertical lever sticking out of the top of this pack so that as it ran under the tank, the lever would get pushed, which would trigger the bomb. Originally, it was meant to be radio controlled, but they didn't have enough radio controlled devices. They would arm the bomb, they would send the dogs out, and the dog handlers were under orders that if the dog attempted to return to Soviet lines, the dog handler was expected to shoot the dog. And so many of these dog handlers put in requests for transfer to ordinary rifle companies, which, let's face it, were going to be infinitely more dangerous than sitting in a trench and sending a dog out. But for them, that was far more desirable than having to sit there with a loaded weapon ready to shoot the dog that you had spent all this time training if it attempted to come back to you. And you can imagine these poor creatures with the noise and the smoke and the smell of the battlefield. They would be terrified and they would just try to seek comfort. And where are they going to go? They're going to go looking for their handler, and then the handler has to kill them. The Soviets continued experimenting with anti-tank dogs into the 1960s. Jaw is still planning this sort of thing. I mean, there are all these stories about all sorts of nations trying to use dolphins to attack divers or whatever. I don't know. I've never been lucky enough to meet a dolphin. I don't know how I would feel about that, but I have huge experience with dogs. So, yeah, it's much more personal, if you like.
Well, now that we hate the Russians a whole bunch, let's just go back to that Nazi side of things, because in this book, there is a nugget that I have never heard of before. And I read a lot of World War II, and I can't believe I missed this. The Nazi hunger plan for Russia and the surrounding area. Now, apparently, as you write, there isn't a lot of documentation on that, but can you tell me a little bit what the Nazi hunger plan was for Russia?
Absolutely. It's very important to get this the right way around. You're talking about 20 million odd people killed in the Soviet Union in the Second World War. Just a huge, huge number. Waitman Bjorn, who's an American who lives in northern England and who lectures on Holocaust studies and has written about the Holocaust, in his books, he makes the point very eloquently that these deaths did not occur because the Germans decided to invade the Soviet Union. It's the other way around. They invaded the Soviet Union to kill these people. The whole point of the invasion was to create a land empire for Germany that would make it safe forever from naval blockades and from the West, etc. And this involved explicitly eliminating huge swathes of the population of Eastern Europe, and particularly the Slav nations. So that very much fed into the whole Nazi racial theory business. There were various calculations done on if we want to seize huge amounts of grain from Ukraine and other productive areas, well, where's that grain going now? The answer is it's going to the cities of the Soviet Union, where population growth in the years between the First and Second World Wars was very substantial as these cities industrialized. So the Germans very cold-bloodedly just said, well, those people are just going to have to starve to death because we need the food for our own uses. So, yeah, we'll just let them starve, and that'll actually help clear the way for German settlers then to move into those areas. So it was a very explicit policy that people were going to die because of the way that the Germans wanted to take control of those areas. And as this hunger plan evolved in the months before the German invasion, the numbers of projected deaths grew with each iteration because they increased the amount of grain that they were planning to seize. I guess once you've made a decision that you're going to starve X million people to death, if someone comes along and says, actually, we're going to starve twice as many, well, it's just another big number. We get back to this business of, the failure of emotional arithmetic. You just don't really see that. People don't see 2 million deaths as twice as bad. The real manifestation of this was in the siege of Leningrad, where Hitler decided he was not going to commit Army Group North to street-by-street conquest of Leningrad. So as Army Group North approached the city, and you have German senior officers talking about the importance of using, if the population of Leningrad attempts to escape from this death, and if they attempt to break through our lines, we're going to have to use artillery to kill these civilians because it would be too distressing for German soldiers to open fire upon women and children. So, they were worried about the emotional impact upon their own men without even acknowledging the enormity of what they were inflicting upon other human beings. And again, this is something that I feel kind of gets missed out in an awful lot of Second World War history. That I think all of the attention that's given to, which divisions moved where and how many tanks they had and, where a particular air landing was carried out, people kind of miss out on the fact that people were dying in huge numbers. And I keep coming back to this point. You should never, ever lose sight of the fact that people died in all of these stories.
And it's also this horrible kind of escalation because, especially as everyone knows, towards the end of the Second World War, if you were a German, you're like, how far away are the Russians and how far away are the Americans or the Brits? Because I know which way I'm going. But when you talk about the Nazis versus the Red Army, it was, you better not get taken, because if you get taken, you're dead in a very, very terrible way. And also, if you try and go backwards at all, you're going to die anyway, which means it's just... not to put too fine a point on it, it's a meat grinder because people can't go either way. So it's just keep fighting until you're dead.
And it's terrible for both sides too. The Germans then are facing an increasingly implacable enemy. As the war continued, many Soviet units started keeping what were known as revenge books. So soldiers could write in these books things that they had seen when they had cleared the Germans out of various areas. Or they could write about what had happened to members of their family in areas that had been occupied by the Germans. These excerpts would be read out at political meetings in order to keep the troops motivated to keep going and to kill as many Nazis as they could. So, yeah, you're right. Both sides showed little hesitation in shooting people rather than taking them prisoner. I'm sure that we know this happened in the West too, but nowhere near to the scale that it happened in the East. And as the war continued, of course, the Red Army was increasingly minded not to take prisoners because they had this massive accumulation of evidence of what had been done to their own people. And then on both sides, you have this rigid enforcement of discipline. You have Stalin's order of not one step back, and people are going to be executed if they do. And then as the war starts to go very badly for Germany, you have similar measures being taken there. And you're right, these guys in the front line are just caught in the most awful position. The guys on the other side of the front line are trying to kill you, and the guys behind you are kind of minded to kill you too if you don't do as you're told. It's just the most horrendous and appalling situation you can imagine. And some of the stories that we hear coming out of eastern Ukraine now just show you that nothing really changes, where there are these stories of Russians who have refused to report when they have been drafted, find themselves sent off to prison where they're forcibly recruited into the Wagner units. So they end up in the same place, And again, you have stories of people being punished or even executed for refusing to go into the front line. Yeah, this sort of appalling level of coercion continues to this day.
And you mentioned it, Stalin's one step back. And, well, let's talk about the butchers at the top, Stalin and Hitler. One thing that strikes me, and it's very often, I think, overlooked, is how ridiculously involved in the day-to-day Hitler and Stalin were. That often things would stop on the ground because they're like, well, we got to check with Adolf first. Where I just think about it like, right, if the American army was waiting for Roosevelt to say, yeah, move the 3rd Division up, everything would have ground to a halt. Whereas Hitler and Stalin, let's just both say absolute mass murderers, they were so involved in the day-to-day, and it just, when you step back and look at it, it's kind of insane, right?
Absolutely it is, and particularly in the case of Hitler, where, this is a guy who had risen to the dizzying ranks of corporal in the First World War. It's not even as if he had a great military record to draw on. Stalin had fought successfully in the Russian Civil War and had led large units and at least had a modicum of understanding of, large-scale battles. Hitler most certainly didn't. And then you have these ludicrous radio conversations with division and corps commanders on the front line where he wants to know how many machine guns they have covering a particular cemetery or whatever. And he's saying, I think you need more machine guns. Do you really want your head of state micromanaging the battlefield to that extent? I think the other interesting thing that comes out of this for me, though, and so let me just turn this on its head. I would suggest to you that actually the American experience was slightly unusual here. Churchill's pressure to mount operations like in the Aegean, for example, pretty much everything where he came up against professional soldiers and he stamped his foot and said, no, we're going to do as I say. Pretty much every time he got it wrong. And Roosevelt was kind of smarter than that. And I also, and I'd be very interested for people to think about this. I wonder whether the American experience was different because it was America and because of the cultural differences, where I cannot imagine somebody like Bradley or Patton taking kindly to a civilian politician from a distance, saying to them, I think you need another 2 companies on the left flank here or whatever. American military was, if you like, as professional as the German military. It didn't have that rigid obedience that so paralyzed so much of the German military. First of all, they were lucky that they had Roosevelt, who was smart enough to let the professionals get on with the job. But secondly, I think that actually the institutions of the United States just would not have tolerated that level of micromanagement by politicians. Though some of the stories one hears of, Cold War and later American presidents phoning up pilots on bombing runs in Vietnam to speak to them, you're just left thinking, yeah, they were really lucky to have Roosevelt at the time.
Well, I will say that it should be said, Patton didn't listen to anybody, no matter what. Bradley would. Patton and MacArthur, it didn't matter who was talking. They were going to argue and they were going to say they were wrong. When you look at this kind of from a high level, did the Germans lose? Did the Russians win? Or was it both? Was it just a race to the bottom almost as far as how this all turned out?
So if we look at the war on the Eastern Front as a whole, you can certainly argue that the Germans lost because in the end, they just lacked the resources, even without D-Day and without the Second Front on the West. From even during the Stalingrad campaign, so even from the summer of 1942, the Germans are really struggling to find enough fuel to keep all of their units moving. The drive on Stalingrad stops from time to time while they wait for somebody to scrounge up enough barrels of fuel to get the tanks going again. And this just gets worse and worse as the war progresses. But then you add in the additional strain of the Western Allies landing in Normandy. And to give you an idea of the scale of what this meant, the Allied forces that landed in Normandy brought ashore more trucks than the German army possessed in the entire war. And moreover, the British and the Americans and the Canadians and everybody else kept those trucks fueled and working, whereas the Germans couldn't do that. So yes, first of all, Germany's going to run out of resources, so they're tinkering around, and we've got a new version of the Panzer IV with a better gun and slightly better armor, and we're going to make a few hundred of these. Meanwhile, you've got the Russians turning out literally tens of thousands of tanks. And okay, they may not individually be particularly brilliant, but when you have that many, it doesn't really matter that much. So first of all, Germany was out-resourced. And if it didn't win quickly, it wasn't going to win. The longer the war went on, the more likely it was simply to run out of resources. But I think one of the lessons that comes out of the books I've written and my studies on those books is that it was a very convenient story during the 1950s, 60s, 70s that the Red Army won the war just by sheer weight of numbers. It was the Soviet steamroller that crushed the Germans, because that was the narrative that the German generals had written in their memoirs after the war. And because during the Cold War, those memoirs were accepted without any criticism or question in the West, that became the prevailing narrative. Yeah, we would have won if it hadn't been for that pesky Hitler getting all the decisions wrong. We would have won if the roads had been a bit better and the weather hadn't been so rubbish, and if there just hadn't been so many Soviet soldiers. But actually, when you look at it, the Red Army was getting better and better at what it did. And you could almost draw a graph on this of the Soviets get better. They actually start paying more attention to proper logistic and engineering support for their units. Stalin, by luck or judgment, ends up with a body of generals that he feels he can trust to make decisions without him micromanaging them. Meanwhile, the Germans are going in completely the reverse direction. Hitler increasingly doesn't trust anybody to make any decisions. So the micromanagement that was bad in the first place just gets truly awful by the time you get into 1944. And as you said, you have panzer divisions sitting around unable to intervene on the Normandy beaches because Hitler is asleep and nobody can move them without his permission. The graph goes in opposite ways. The Red Army is becoming more capable, more competent, more skillful. The generals learn better on how to do what they do. And again, one of the things that comes out of this is that, people like Zhukov, they were butchers and they threw men at the Germans and they had no compunction about sacrificing tens of thousands of men. But there was a certain acceptance of reality on the Soviet side that ultimately the Red Army was a blunt instrument. This was not a fencing rapier. This was a cudgel. Now, you can get better at how you swing that cudgel and you can get a little bit more skillful at how you use it, but it's never going to be a broadsword. And sure, they could get better at how they swung their cudgel. They could get a slightly better shaped cudgel, but in the end, it was going to bludgeon the enemy into defeat. And, in the middle of an existential war where, as when we were talking about the hunger plan, defeat would have meant the annihilation of their entire people. This is no time to decide, guys, we need to get rid of our cudgel and get a broadsword. You've just got to fight with what you've got. And if that means that you have to accept very, very high casualty rates, then that's how it has to be. And I think part of the key for the Soviets was realizing that some of their pre-war thinking and doctrine, where they were trying to emulate the way the Germans carried out operations, it was just never going to work for the Red Army. They had to work with what they had. But even then, at the moment I'm researching and writing about summer 1944 and the great Soviet offensive of summer 44, by then they've got the operational art and the tactical art pretty much nailed.
And something that I always key in on when you're talking about these resources, like you did on both sides of Germany at this point, is you will read about Germany, and inevitably, if you really dig into the tactics, you will hear about them still using horses. Because, we go through school, you learn about the Blitzkrieg, and you just think of this gigantic, well-oiled machine, and then you dig in and you realize, oh, well, we're going to bring the cannons up with some horses.
Yeah, exactly. So, you have maybe 30-odd motorized or panzer divisions, which are very much what we think of in Blitzkrieg. So we've got track vehicles, towed guns, etc., and they're motoring along and leaving the French and the Poles and even the Soviets floundering in their wake. Absolutely right. And then you've got all of those hundreds of infantry divisions. And, on the TOE of an infantry division into the mid-1940s, there are still several thousand horses per division. And these horses are used by liaison officers. They're used to tow equipment, including a lot of the artillery. And in that terrible winter outside Moscow at the end of 1941, very large numbers of horses die because, you can tell soldiers that, guys, you're just going to have to tighten your belts. You're going to have to manage on what little rations we can get you. You do that to a horse, it'll die. That's just the reality of it. So either you accept that all of your draft animals are going to die, or else you have to move them somewhere where there is pasture, where it's easier to get fodder for them, which means that if you then have to retreat, you have no way of moving your artillery. You end up having to abandon guns. And in the First World War, for example, more railway space to moving feed for horses than it was to moving feed for humans. That's an indication of just the sheer scale of logistic support needed by horses. Also, when all of these, big draft horses that have been pulling artillery pieces and pulling big wagons and ammunition wagons, etc., when these horses died in that first winter, you can't just magic these animals up from nowhere. One of the striking things is that even by the winter of 1941, this army of the legendary Blitzkrieg is actually becoming really quite immobile, particularly at the infantry level. So German infantry divisions can put up a very, very stiff fight, and, provided they're in anything approaching organized defensive positions, they can be a very, very tough nut to crack. But by the time you get to, the Stalingrad winter and certainly 43 and into 44, the Red Army has realized if you can drive the Germans out of their positions, it's easy. And a lot of this is just down to that relative lack of mobility.
So one of the big things I always ask an author, Prit, is something like Meat Grinder. Oh, I learned World War II in high school. They made me take a test on it. History is boring. Like, why should I read this book? If I put one of those people in front of you and said, I've read history. Why do I need to read this book? What would you say?
I would say that there are so many parallels to what was happening around the Rzhev Salient, to what's happening in eastern Ukraine now. And there's a little bit of Marxist theory, which I think is relevant here. One of the teachings of Marxism is that every organization's primary purpose is to reproduce itself. And this is why whenever you have communist regimes coming to power, for example, in Cambodia, the first thing you do is you kill all the intelligentsia, because you don't want the lawyers creating another generation of bourgeois lawyers. You don't want teachers creating the same structures again. You want proper revolutionary-inspired people to replace them. So, yeah, they kill them all. But also, ultimately, I just love telling stories, and I just love some of these extraordinary tales that I discover when I'm researching this. And these stories deserve to be better known because they are just, what we were saying earlier on about the ability of people to make sense of chaos and to make things right and to make stuff work when it's gone terribly wrong.
Totally agree, Prit. I loved it. Thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about it. And that's it for this episode. Prit, thank you so much for coming on. Nerds, reach out to us. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Listen to other episodes of the podcast. Head on over to the blog. Leave us 5-star reviews. Everything you can do, reach out, please do it. Until next time, stay cool, nerds.